This is Steve Laffey's Fixing America. And now, broadcasting live from the Fixing America Command Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, here is your host, Steve Laffey.
Steve Laffey here with Steve Laffey's Fixing America. What a great day to be with you right up here, Colorado, up here in Fort Collins. I think we've got a great show today. It's a little complicated. We're going to try to make this simple. But as we get going here, don't forget, we're at LaffeyRadio.com, www.LaffeyRadio.com. And we'd love you to like us on Facebook, if that's the right term, Laffey Radio on Facebook. And, of course, follow us on Twitter at Laffey Radio. We're here every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 1 o'clock Mountain Time where I'm located, but Eastern Time is what we broadcast in. And we're here to really forcibly change the nature of the debate. I've been very frustrated, and I know you have too, and many millions of Americans about the type of news that we get, the lack of really solutions to problems. And this is what the show deals with. We're going to try to solve some of these problems and get it out there as simple as we can for the people of America so that we know the problems and we know how to solve them. And today we're going to be talking about J.P. Morgan, the largest bank in America, but we're really going to be talking about much more than J.P. Morgan. We're going to be talking about how to fix this problem that we've had for a long time with the banks, and it's only gotten worse. So let's step back for a second. Back in 2008, the beginning of the financial crisis, the six largest banks, and that would be J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, they had about 37% of the assets of America, of your assets. So that's a lot. It's too much. It was one of the reasons there was such a big problem. It was one of the reasons that Hank Paulson and George Bush and everybody kind of panicked. Not that they should have panicked, but it's one of the reasons they did. Well, after 5 years have gone by, we are now at where the six largest banks have 67% of your assets, of Americans' assets. That means that about 7,000 other banks have the other 33%. This is totally out of control. The banks have, according to regulators, become almost too big to fail. They were too big to fail last time. And last time it was really about their stockholders failing. Not about the firms failing, but the stockholders being wiped out in many respects. And so recently, the reason we'll talk about J.P. Morgan at the beginning is they have come to an agreement for some of the fraudulent activity that has happened, that they have partaken in and been involved in over the last several years. They've agreed to pay a fine of about $13 billion. $13 billion is almost about half of their net income. And if you take into account what they paid out from what they call the whale trade, where they had this trader lose $6 billion and paid a $1 billion fine, you're talking about $20 billion over the last 2 years in fines and losses because they're so big that they can't, one reason, they can't even oversee their traders. So this is a giant problem for us because they've gotten so big and so powerful. I mean, last year, J.P. Morgan spent the most amount for any banks on lobbying, about $8 billion. That's up from like $6.8 billion, and it just keeps going up. I don't know what the number is this year as we report this in 2013, but this is a giant problem. But what might be even the bigger problem is no one's really talking about the solutions for these banks. What we tend to get time after time are magazine articles defending J.P. Morgan, analysts defending J.P. Morgan. They call him the greatest CEO in the country to this very day. Since 2009, forget about the two instances I've mentioned, the whale trade, where a trader lost $6 billion, and forget about the $13 billion that we're going to get into. The $13 billion that really come from their losses on making fraudulent mortgages to people and the purchases of Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual back in 2008 for about $3.5 billion when they knew or had to know that they had made fraudulent loans also. But many commentators, and I'm talking about the biggest ones in the country, are talking about these losses as if they don't really belong to J.P. Morgan. They belong to something that happened before they bought the firm. Well, any transaction, unless you categorically state hey, I'm not responsible for anything you've done in the past, then you are. When you buy a company's assets, you also buy their liabilities. You buy the whole company. So they are responsible for them. But time after time, we will see that analysts, investment bankers, the people on Wall Street, the people making the news today, the people writing the editorials, they have come to the conclusion that no, those things happened before. And that this settlement is really the government simply going after J.P. Morgan and Jamie Dimon, its CEO, because I guess he's not that great of a Democrat anymore or something like that. The way they've concocted their versions of what's been happening to J.P. Morgan is not really what's been happening. J.P. Morgan has systematically engaged in many, many violations over the years, one after the other. Since 2009, it's been 12% of their net income. So they have a philosophy at the bank. We can go violate laws, and then we can just, if we make $4, we'll just pay out $1. If we make $10, we're paying out $1. Nobody's going to jail. For example, let me just take the most recent Wall Street Journal. There's the biggest magazine in the country, biggest financial magazine, comes out every day. Their editorial is called The Morgan Shakedown. Let me go through the Morgan Shakedown with you. It starts off with the tentative $13 billion settlement that the Justice Department appears to be extracting. Now, extracting is not because they did anything wrong. They're just extracting it from J.P. Morgan, according to the Wall Street Journal editorial board. Needs to be understood as a watershed moment in American capitalism. Federal law enforcers are confiscating, meaning taking illegally, roughly half the company's annual earnings, that's the $13 billion this year, for no other reason than because they can and because they want to appease their left-wing populist allies. Folks, J.P. Morgan and the companies that they bought, Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, they engaged in fraudulent transactions that are much bigger than $13 billion. Why do you think there are so many people still underwater on their mortgages? They packaged mortgages with liar loans from 2003 through 2007. They built up brokers. They sold these things. They knew that they were bad. Everybody knew they were bad. How do I know they knew they were bad? I knew they were bad. My friends in the brokerage industry knew they were bad. My friends who did mortgages knew they were bad. They knew that when you don't put anything down on a house, 0% down, or what they call liar loans for incomes, all these things that we've been reading about, they knew they were bad. And so when it all came to fruition, when the losses came out, J.P. Morgan's getting off actually pretty well. But the article goes on. It never, actually, this is one of these articles that never really stops. They were largely issued, they want to get back to the fact that the securities, the fraudulent securities that were packaged and sold to buyers weren't simply a J.P. Morgan product. Quote, they were largely issued by Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, both of which the federal government asked J.P. Morgan to take over to help ease the crisis. So what? This is what we don't hear anymore. This is what we're hearing in clip after clip and getting ready for the show, clip after clip from analysts and people in the financial industry and people doing the financial shows, that it was something that happened before, as if that matters. J.P. Morgan paid about $3.5 billion to buy Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, knowing full well they were taking on all the liabilities. That's why they paid $3.5 billion and not $30.5 billion. And so as these losses have added up, J.P. Morgan is actually getting off pretty well. But the article goes on, and it gets worse. One of the things that they go through is that they say, you would think that $13 billion, the largest such settlement against a U.S. company, would be enough. But the political left isn't satisfied these days with cash, though it will take what it can get. Listen, I'm not the political left, and no one's going to accuse me of being the political left. I'm not happy with this. I'm not happy that people haven't gone to jail who made these fraudulent loans. I'm not happy that no executives of banks have been put in jail. Obviously, some should have been. They knew what was going on. They go on. The truth is that they didn't indict bankers because the 2008 crisis wasn't the result of bank fraud. Yes, it was. Despite the liberal mythology, I can't even say this word. It was a classic credit panic caused by bad government policy coinciding with the rational exuberance of bankers who were responding to the incentives for excess risk-taking that the government created. No. There were trillions of fraudulent loans packaged together and sold to people that weren't worth what they said they were worth. But the article really ends, it doesn't end, but it really goes on to this point that I must tell you. The journal writes, "We'd like to see Mr. Diamond fight the charges, but the political reality is that he and his bank don't have much choice." They have a lot of choice. The saying that they don't have a lot of choice, what does that mean? When I was involved in being the president of an investment bank or running the division of an investment bank or being a mayor of a city and having to make decisions about which lawsuit we would go after, I can give you one clear example. As mayor of Cranston, it was very clear to me that a city council and or a mayor previous to me had committed fraud by changing the wording in a contract for retirees so that $100 million was added basically to the liabilities of the city. And if we could win back that case, we would win $3.2 million per year forever or $100 million off the liabilities. Okay. Had to make a decision about whether to go forward with the case. The likelihood of winning was not in our favor. It was probably, some say 15%, some say 25%. Let's just say it was a 20% chance of winning. We had the best lawyers, and we thought, and I thought, well, if it's $125,000 to take on this case in legal fees over a year or two, and we have a 20% chance of winning $3 million per year forever, effectively, we should do it. JP Morgan's in the same exact case. $13 billion or fight. Why is the political reality that they can't fight? Mark Cuban, who you probably have heard of, who runs the Dallas basketball team, the Dallas Mavericks, he was sued by the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. He fought. He spent an awful lot of money in legal fees, I bet. He knew he was right. He took a giant risk to take on that case. He won. I don't know the exact amount of how we can equate the possibility of jail for him or civil penalties for him versus this case, but he made a decision. And if you just look at how much money they could probably spend, let's say it was $1 billion to defend this case. $1 billion is an awful lot of $1,000 an hour lawyers out of New York City or out of Washington. It's a lot. So let's say it's $1 billion. Is it a 10% chance of winning? You should take it on. Obviously, J.P. Morgan and Jamie Dimon, CEO, they probably think it's a big loser. That's why they're not taking it on. Exactly the opposite of what the Wall Street Journal and most of the financial press is writing today. J.P. Morgan obviously knows there is a giant lawsuit and they can lose, and they could lose $50 billion. In fact, the losses are bigger than that. What they caused through their firm, Washington Mutual, which they bought, and Bear Stearns in 2008 is far greater than $13 billion. They know that. I know that. You know that. The Security Exchange, the Attorney General's office knows that. But the financial press continues to give J.P. Morgan and Jamie Dimon in particular a pass no matter what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years. Let's go play, if we could, boss. We got an analyst here, Mike Mayo, who works for CSLM, just to hear the typical comment from analysts on Wall Street, the people who cover J.P. Morgan, who mostly say buy J.P. Morgan no matter what. That's what they get paid to do because they got investment banking deals coming up. But listen to at least what one analyst, and he kind of represents most of them, say about J.P. Morgan and the settlement. Go ahead if you would, boss.
This would be a win-win solution. For the government, this would be the largest corporate settlement in history. For J.P. Morgan, it would allow them to put together many different legal issues and help put those behind.
It's a win-win situation for J.P. Morgan because all this analyst really cares about is the uncertainty he looks at in the marketplace. They're going to be able to put that behind them. It's a win for the Justice Department because they extract $13 billion from J.P. Morgan. So it's a win-win situation. Well, in many ways, it could be perceived that way, but there's nothing really wrong with what happened at J.P. Morgan. This analyst has ignored all, and by the way, maybe he's supposed to ignore the way he does his business. He's sitting there saying to himself, well, no one's going to jail. In fact, one of the things that is so true and should not be true is that if you remember back to the Enron case back in the early 2000s, when Enron went down, Arthur Andersen went down because the federal government went after them. They brought Arthur Andersen to zero, basically, disbanded the firm and so forth. You can read articles, an article over here from LA Times that states that the Justice Department has been wary about taking on these big financial collapses and the big wrongdoings in the financial sector because they're afraid they might take down a firm. And I say, what do you mean wary? Why wouldn't you take on what is right? Why wouldn't you go and let the chips fall where they may? One of the things that's happened since Enron, we haven't seen as much accounting fraud from big accounting firms because one firm everybody lost their money at Arthur Andersen. So if we had a situation where people were wrong and the fines were what they're supposed to be, and if J.P. Morgan stock, like in 2008, like a lot of financial companies should have, if the stocks had gone to zero, well then people would have done it again. But they're back to doing it again now. They're all back to doing the same games. And that gets back to the whole system we want to talk about, which is, banks are so big. Some of these banks are so big, it's nearly impossible for them to know what's going on in any one of their divisions. It's not that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan, he's not a smart guy. He's a very smart guy. It has become impossible, the size of his bank, for him to know what's going on with this guy in London, trading securities over his limit, losing $6 billion, now arrested. Almost impossible. So we've got to get to some solutions about this. One of the solutions has to be that banks have to be a lot smaller. So there we've stated. We stated something that is so obvious to me. It's obvious to a lot of my friends. It's never been put out in the financial world since 2008 when the problems happened. Where's the major article in the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Name the magazine about we've got to break the banks up. We've got to make them smaller. That's a solution so we don't have this problem again. The opposite has happened. As we stated earlier, banks, the 6 largest banks, now control 67% of the assets of all America. That's outrageous. The risk is huge. And now the risk is that they know, or they've been through a situation that they've gotten away with. So why not take more risk? If you look at what's happened since 2008, take a look at 2 different situations. One is the Dodd-Frank laws. I can't really explain them to you. I don't think anybody really can. They're so convoluted, but they have to do with banks being regulated a lot more. Why was one of the regulations that they get smaller? Never was brought up. Thousands of pages of regulation. The most obvious thing is to make the banks smaller. And let's go through why. Let's just say you're in Connecticut and you have a Connecticut bank. Aren't you the most likely to make the best loans to people in Connecticut? You actually would know the people. We have banks, they have no idea. They just go through formulas. And then they've got to get a high return on equity. So they got to get a high return on equity. It started back in the 1980s and then through the 1990s. And it ended with, it started really in 1999 with the Glass-Steagall, which was a law put in the 1930s during the Great Depression when banks did not have a lot of control. When people got together and said, listen, banks take little risk and investment banks take a lot of risk. Banks, that's what we're going to do. We're going to split them aside. So you investment bankers like Steve Laffey, like me, who was an investment banking firm, you guys you can stay up all night, take a lot of risk, make more money. But when you bring the whole firm down, you bring just the firm down. The banks, they need them to show up at 8 o'clock in the morning. We need bankers to make loans to people they know. We need them to go take a nice lunch and leave at like 4 o'clock. And we need a leverage ratio over there in the banks of something of like 8-to-1 or less. And just to go through that quickly, a 10-to-1 leverage ratio in a bank means that you took in $1 million from people, little old ladies came in, they put money in savings deposits, you're paying them now, it's a whole nother story we'll do, 0.1% instead of 3%, destroying savers all over America the last 5 years. And then we lend it out for a car loan for 6% and make wide spreads, or we just leave it at the Federal Reserve because they're printing money. Another story too. But so we can lend it out. So we have $1 million here, $10 million of loans outstanding. And so when we make a really bad loan and we don't diversify, if 10% goes bad, we lose the whole firm. At 8-to-1 or 7-to-1, it's 15%. And when you diversify, it's an unlikely event. Bear Stearns was leveraged up 30-to-1. Some of these banks had leverage ratios that so 30-to-1 means if 3%, folks, of your loans go bad, you're wiped out. That's the Bear Stearns situation. They had way more than that. That's, by the way, the General Electric situation. A AAA firm that, because they were involved in the financing of lots of different stuff, but borrowed short and lent long and had the rates mixed up on them for about several months, they were basically broke too. And they were too big. So this is a giant problem. One of the solutions has got to be making banks smaller. We're going to take a quick break here. We're going to come back. We're going to play a clip on the way in from the Attorney General Holder. We're going to talk about that and play some more clips and get to the second solution that we have to get to. This is Steve Laffey. Steve Laffey's Fixing America. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Stay tuned. Steve Laffey's Fixing America returns after these commercial messages.
Picture this, your next trip, Utah, 5 national parks. First, Zion. You're walking, the ground rises, the ground drops, the ground becomes water. Next, Bryce. You're riding a mule. You're riding a mule under giant orange strip castles. You are not dreaming. You will not forget this. On to Capitol Reef. Take the scenic route, the really scenic route. Take a path you've never taken and see the stars for the first time. Now for Canyonlands. You're riding a bike. You're riding a bike on Mars. Now you're riding the rapids. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, Classic. Arches, 5:32 a.m. Some things are worth racing the sunrise for. The horizon lightens. You round the corner. Whoa. This is Life Elevated. The Mighty 5. 5 iconic parks, 1 epic experience. Plan your trip at visitutah.com.
I am an American soldier.
I'm a warrior and a member of a team.
I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values.
I will always place this first.
I will never accept defeat.
I will never accept defeat.
I will never quit.
I will never leave a fallen comrade.
I am disciplined.
I am disciplined.
Physically and mentally tough.
Trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills.
I'm an expert and I'm a professional.
I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the
enemies of the United States of America in close combat.
I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life.
I am an American soldier.
I am an American soldier.
I am an American soldier.
There's strong, and there's Army Strong. See what it takes at GoArmy.com.
When I have an asthma attack, I feel scared.
It's like tiny nails in the air poke my lungs.
I start to cough. Sometimes my parents have to take me to the hospital.
Today, children suffer from some form of asthma, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all emergency room visits.
I feel like I'm choking. It's kind of like an elephant is on my chest. A little whistle sound comes out when I breathe.
But while your child may suffer from asthma doesn't have to make your child suffer. There are simple ways you can prevent your child's next attack. To learn more, log on to www.noattacks.org or call your doctor, because even one attack is one too many.
I feel like a fish with no water.
Brought to you by the EPA, the Ad Council, and this station.
And now, back to the Fixing America radio program with your host, Steve Laffey.
The concern that you have raised is one that I frankly share. And I'm not talking about HSBC now, that maybe that not be appropriate. But I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large.
Too big to fail? Too big to go to jail. And there's Eric Holder, the Attorney General, who I have massive disagreements with, talking about his problems as it relates to, again, what I talked about in the last section. He doesn't want to be responsible for taking down a segment of the economy. He wants to go after the right people. In this particular case, I think he's trying to. And it's a situation where, should we be wary of that? I mean, this whole thought process that we are beholden to these banks, they are just too powerful now. There's nothing we can do. Can't even prosecute them. I mean, you get a fine out of them. It takes years to go through this data. Imagine how many documents there really are. I mean, there's piles of them. It would look something like Raiders of the Lost Ark's final scene where they're pushing the Ark into a room somewhere in Washington. You can't even imagine. So they got these regulators trying to go through this stuff. But if the banks were smaller, Mr. Holder, Attorney General Holder, would that be as big of a problem? If it was Connecticut Bank and Trust that was screwing around with people's money, it would take 7 guys to go in there, or ladies. And then they go after them and say, no, you guys, we're taking you down. In the savings and loan disaster, thousands of executives actually went to jail. In the 2008 disaster to today, which is still going on, is it 1? 2? There's nobody. So you have this chicken and the egg problem. I mean, can you figure out who did what was wrong? Can you find them? And then you have this other situation, which I disagree with, Eric Holder mentions, is he's wary. He's wary, like I mentioned, after Enron took down Arthur Andersen, the accountants for Enron back in the early 2000s. They've been wary about this. They shouldn't be. Go find out what the truth is. Go find out who made these mistakes. Find out who issued these fraudulent loans. Throw some in jail if you want to stop the bad behavior. I mean, I have 6 children. It's really no different, but on a massive scale of raising children. If you want brats as they're teenagers, don't discipline them when they're 5. And don't let the other ones know you disciplined them. Then they'll all act like nuts. And you'll have a terrible time. That's what we're having in a macroeconomic sense right now. We're having a terrible time. We can't put the genie back in the bottle because the lobbying power of these large banks is so big and their power in Washington is so huge. And the ads they take out in newspapers is so large. I'll give you an example over here. I saved this article, and I didn't really notice in the Wall Street Journal last week, there was another op-ed called Sending a Bad Message to Big Banks. And this article is all about how you really shouldn't go after these big banks and how JP Morgan, you're going to need JP Morgan and banks like JP Morgan when the next small banks go out of business, because they're the ones who take them over and they take over their assets and they run the banks. And the Fed has done this many, many times. The FDIC, I should say, through 2008. Many banks on Friday night, not many, but go out of business. Monday morning, they're reorganized, and you're not banking at Joe Blow Bank in Wichita, Kansas. Wichita is probably a bad example. They didn't have too many bad loans. But you're banking at Bank of America the next Monday morning. Fine. Then I noticed a couple things. The article is written by, a man who worked at his career at Bank of America. And I turned the page over, and of course, it's a full-page ad for Capital One, another financial institution. Okay, I get it. But we've got to get our lawmakers to focus in on the problems. And the problem, number one, is how big these banks are because they become extremely inefficient. I'll give you an example. Take an Intel chip or an LED chip or a wafer, whatever we call the wafer. We know that chips and chip companies become far more efficient and lower the price of our computers in such a drastic way under what they call Moore's Law, M-O-O-R-E, apostrophe S, Moore's Law, that the faster you can make these is dependent, the speed of these chips is dependent upon the size of the market and how you get them out there. Great. The bigger Intel gets, the more efficient it really gets. Now, there's some thought if it gets to a certain size, maybe it won't be quite as efficient, but it gets more efficient, that firm. Other firms are like that too, to a point. Banks are not like that. There's a very little evidence to be made that banks, the bigger they get more efficient. They have a higher return on assets. How do we know? Look at the history of banks since 1933, since they broke the banks up from Glass-Steagall Act. They took the banks and the investment banks and they split them up. And that's really number two that has to happen. Banks need to be smaller. Let's just put out a rule that no bank can have more than 0.5% of the assets of America. So they'll be fighting amongst each other, but they know they can only get so big. Put in another rule. We're bringing back Glass-Steagall, and we'll call another law if you want, but banks can no longer be associated with investment banks. But look at the history. If you go through the 80s and you look at Walter Wriston, who ran Bank of America, he's trying to get bigger internationally. So they had to get bigger. So he's making loans with Saudi Arabia and telling the people when they find oil back then, oh, we can't really take so much money. You'll have to pay us interest. And he's calling up people in South America and saying, hey, we can lend you money, but you're a bad risk. We got to charge you 15%. He was trying to make his margins really wide. Okay. The next move that happened in the 80s and really into the 90s, into the late 90s, was this constant looking over at the investment banks who were sort of getting into the banking business little by little. Charles Schwab had started, and they really weren't in it. But the bank said, look, our return on equity, our return on investment's going down. We got to get bigger faster. We need some of that initial public offering money that those investment banks are doing with those 6% spreads, overnight spreads. And so between Bill Clinton and George Bush and everybody around during the late 1990s and 2001, they sold us all the bill of goods that it was okay to put them back together. Now, full disclosure, by the way, I personally have benefited. I didn't make the decision on where Morgan Keegan, the firm I was the president of, got sold to, but it was sold to a bank. Because I worked for the bank for about 25 days, and then I went home to be the mayor of Cranston. And but after that, bad things started happening, and Morgan Keegan went through a really rough period, and so did Regions Financial. But back to this story, it's the search for growth, and by the way, this is just human nature in some respects. They're searching for growth. They want to grow faster, but unless we are going to say, when they go broke, there's no FDIC insurance, there's no regulation, it's the 1870s, everybody have fun, which we're not going to do, then the regulation has to be simple and be clear so that you and I understand it. No more laws of 2,000 pages. Nothing really longer than the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. Nothing that long. We know if we did those two things, we would be back to safety again. And if we added in a third thing, which is basically that when you buy a home, you have to put down 20%. And for people who are my age and older or younger than me, you remember that was just simply the stated rule. When you bought a home, you had to come down with 20%. So if you had to buy a $200,000 home, you had to come up with $40,000 for the down payment. You were buying a very illiquid asset. It's not like trading stocks over here. If I could on my right in this computer, I could just go on a computer screen. I could buy IBM and say to myself, oh, that was bad. 3 minutes later, sell it. Boom, I'm out. I pay $8. It's very, very liquid. Houses are not liquid. Anybody listening who's had a house in the last 7 years know they're basically not very liquid. And so that's why you have your skin in the game. You have your equity interest in the game for a loan. And that's why from the 1930s to 2007, we didn't have any problems. We had not any problems. We didn't have the problems of the magnitude that we had in 2007 because we didn't have people putting nothing down, getting 125% of the equity in the home loans, 125 loans. We didn't have liar loans. And those are the loans that everybody knew about. People were just going in saying, I make $300,000, I'm a carpenter. Oh, you make $300,000, you're a carpenter. Wow. By the way, let's not just take 34% of your income as you can get a loan. Let's take 20%. Let's make it divide by 20%. Here's $1 million home. Here's a $1.2 million home. But the person was only making $150,000. Those are the liar loans. So we can get back to this, but these things aren't really even being discussed out in the open. So we've got a serious problem here. We've got even some of the best CEOs of the past are in it. They're in this game defending each other over and over again. We've got a clip. It's clip 5, I think, Boris. It's Jack Welch, who ran General Electric. He ran it very well until about 2000, 2001. He got out of the game, and it made me think, I better get out of the game too, because he knew what was going on. I thought he would die in his office. I mean, the guy loved General Electric. He spent his life at General Electric. He grew that firm. He's now in his 80s. And I guess when you get into your 80s, we got to stop listening to you. Listen to what he has to say about Jamie Dimon And I've given you the bad past performance. Look at what he says about Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan. Go ahead, boss.
I think he's a great CEO, and I think he's in the crosshairs, and he'll get through it. And I hope this settlement he gets clears the decks.
Yeah, but Jack, $13 billion is $13 billion.
And for what?
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. You can't just say for what when it's $13 billion. You write a check for $13 billion. There must be something you think you did wrong.
And they're giving it to Fannie and Freddie. Come on, they didn't know what they were buying. Those government boys, come on.
So what do you think? You think this is a witch hunt?
Oh, absolutely. No.
Why is it all J.P. Morgan? Isn't this the company that was the strongest company within the financial collapse back in 2008?
Yeah, and they'll be the other guys will be behind them. They'll be after Bank of America. This is just the beginning. And if they can pay that much, they'll probably leverage them all down based on their earnings capability and get them all. And look, fines are everywhere. You've got regulators looking for everything. Look at New York City. How many food violations are out there? How many they're looking for money everywhere. And the piggy bank is in the private sector, and the public sector is coming to the piggy bank.
Well, I don't know where the food sector came in from New York City. Maybe it was the slushy drinks, the 34-ounce drinks that were made outlawed by Michael Bloomberg for a while. But look at what he said. First of all, he's a great CEO. You can't possibly say that now. Not with 12% of your net income being paid in fines to the federal government over the last years. Not without all the different settlements. Forget about the ones that just happened and the one they're going to do. Forget about the criminality of the actions of the loans that were sold by J.P. Morgan, by Bear Stearns, by Washington Mutual. And then you have Maria Bartolano. I can't really say her last name over at CNBC. And she's saying there must be something. If it's $13 billion, she's saying what I was saying at the beginning of the show. I mean, if it's $13 billion and you're right, why would you pay the fine? I wouldn't pay the fine. I'd go fight it, especially if it's not going to be $13 billion to fight it. And then it's the two words that Jack Welch says, for what? For what? He really thinks that the only reason the government's involved in this is to take down Jamie Dimon because they got him in the crosshairs now, or whatever he says, and that they're going to get their pound of flesh. And there's too much regulation, which there is too much regulation. And there's too much regulation in pages terms in banks. There's thousands and thousands of pages. There's too much regulation. But no one gets at the basic point. These guys fraudulently, knowingly violated securities laws year after year. And then they got bailed out by me and you for the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And the CEOs and the people who ran the firms and the people with the stock options, they kept everything. And you've lost 10 million jobs. We've got a situation where people are getting on Social Security disability because they can't find other jobs. They don't know what to do. They're fraudulently taking fraudulent action themselves to get on Social Security disability. They're taking Social Security too early because effectively leaving the workforce. They're not doing what's best for them. And then you've got the Federal Reserve saying, you know what? We'll really stick it to those savers. The people that we told what a great America this is, that you save your money. We're supposed to save our money for our old age. No. We're going to have you stick it in the stock market again. We're going to run it right back up. It's just a game. And we're going to make everybody feel a little bit wealthier, except more than 50% of the people in America don't own stocks. But we don't care a whit about anybody outside that beltway until we get to San Francisco. We don't care at all about the heartland of America, where people who are 50 years old are saying to themselves today, I guess I better put the money in the stock market because I'm still getting 0.1%. And I kind of plan on getting 4% in CDs. But the Federal Reserve keeps rates so low because the banks have lost so much money through these loans that they made that built up from the late 80s. And then finally, when they broke down Glass-Steagall, it didn't take but 8 years for the whole system to go haywire. And it went haywire because Alan Greenspan and the people at the Fed there now started this whole thing of placating. And look back into the late 1990s, long-term capital, a hedge fund that went belly up, that had too much leverage. It was Alan Greenspan who started this whole ball rolling, that nobody was going to fail by calling in investment banks and telling them to help out or else, calling in banks and telling them to help out or else. And then when long-term capital didn't really go down the way it was supposed to, people said, well, it's not going to happen to me. And now, between the politicians who play musical chairs, whether it's the local politicians or the national politicians who hope that this debt problem doesn't come down on their heads, to the financial companies who now think it's never going to come down on our heads. Let's just keep the party rolling. Let's leverage it up again. I mean, we'll come back after this next break and we'll talk about it. They've leveraged it up again. The banks are just as dangerous as they've been. This is Steve Laffey. Steve Laffey's Fixing America. We'll be back in a couple of minutes with our last segment and some more solutions.
Stay tuned. Steve Laffey's Fixing America returns after these commercial messages.
It's 6:42 p.m. Time for Steve Plato and his son Dylan to do the dishes. They talk about everything from the yuckiness of girls to the awesomeness of his soccer team. Sometimes they don't talk at all. Then, hey! The dreaded splash fight. It's Dad O'Clock, and it's the best time of the day. Because the smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today. Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Well, I finally did it. I opened a 401k.
What? Why? Just wait for the inheritance. We've definitely got a rich uncle somewhere. We're one call away from the winner's circle at the Derby, dinners with multiple forks, a vacation home in the country, using summer as a verb.
You don't actually think that, do you?
When it comes to financial stability, don't get left behind. Get tools and tips for saving at feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of CPAs, the Rhode Island Society of CPAs, and the Ad Council.
I'm in almost every school bus and classroom. I go to school with your children. We say the Pledge of Allegiance together. You see me around the neighborhood and you tell me that I'm a pretty good kid. Well, I'm one out of every 5 children in America, and I'm struggling with hunger. This problem is closer than you think. My teacher tells me we can grow up to be whatever we want. I want to grow up to be someone who doesn't go to bed hungry. There's enough food in this country to feed everybody. Please visit feedingamerica.org today and find your local food bank for ways to help. Every dollar you donate helps provide 8 meals for kids like me, quietly struggling with hunger. Together, we are Feeding America, brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Call to serve. It has no sound, yet I have heard it in the whispered retelling of honorable sacrifices made by those who have served before me. The call to serve has no form, yet I have clearly seen it in the eyes of men and women infinitely more courageous and more driven than most. The call to serve has no weight, yet I have held it in my hands. I will commit to carry it close to my heart until my country is safe and the anguish of those less fortunate has been soothed. The call to serve is at once invisible and always present. And for those who choose to answer the call, for their country, for their fellow man, for themselves, it is the most powerful force on earth. America's Navy, a global force for good.
And now, back to the Fixing America radio program with your host, Steve Laffey.
Here's why they're doing it. Jamie Dimon went from being the greatest banker of all time, leading his company through the financial crisis pretty well, doing the government a favor, to a critic of the Obama administration. And you do not have to be a conspiracy theorist to put those two links together. The minute he started ramping up his critique of Obamanomics, of Dodd-Frank, the president's signature financial reform bill, that's when the hammer started coming down on him. Listen, he opened himself up from a public relations standpoint, I think, by downplaying a loss in London. But let's make no mistake about it. This is all about vindictiveness, and it's really bad for the American political system.
Wow. Political vindictiveness. That's all it is. I guess Jamie Dimon, the lifelong Democrat, decided that he was going to criticize, however slightly, the Obama administration. Wow, it's $13 billion because, according to Charles Gasbaro, who's normally does a lot of good work, but see, he's bought into this whole thing. Somehow he's bought into this whole thing that you can't buy into. Is Eric Holder a political partisan? Yes. Is Barack Obama, the president of the United States, the most political partisan president I've ever seen? Yes. I mean, it's true. Were there trillions of fraudulent mortgages made, packaged, all bad, sold as AAA by J.P. Morgan and the firms that they bought, Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual and a host of other firms? Yes. Yes, they were. That's exactly what happened. So it may be true if Jamie Dimon, who several years ago, when the president would call in all the big bankers, and you have to ask the question, why does the president call in all the big bankers? I don't know. Because they have a lot of power and because he thinks he has power over them because they're all in it together? Something like that. And Jamie Dimon used to sit next to him, I suppose. Now he sits on the other side of the room. So, sure, he's criticized the Bob administration. That can't be the total reason that he settled for $13 billion. Because if that was the reason, Jamie Dimon and his firm, J.P. Morgan, are paying a $13 billion firm to go along with the $1 billion fine last year for improperly trading securities, the $6 billion loss for those securities, and the 12% of net income from 2009 to 2012 for many other violations, including things to do with Cuba. And you go on, there's a whole list of these things that they've settled. And basically for Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan, because they haven't been punished, because they hadn't lost their stock options in 2008, because the stock's at an all-time high and they think they're above the law, they look at it as a loss leader. They look at all these fines as like, $13 billion. Oh, fine. In fact, let's find a way to take a tax break for that, even though that's against the law too. Let's make sure that they tell us it's not punitive, that it's something like remedial. There's a word in the tax code, by the way. This is why the tax code has to go. I don't know if it's section 1602, something like that. I have to go look this up again. But it's if they don't make it punitive for this $13 billion fine, it'll be like a $8.5 billion fine because they'll just take a tax write-off on it versus their income. So Charles Gazbaro is way off base, as many people are. We've got a lot of clips here, and we should probably try to go some. In fact, there's one clip that the man goes beyond Charles Gazbaro. I think that's clip 4. Let's hear from Matt Kaiser, who's an analyst over there in London, about what he thinks about Jamie Dimon. I don't know if we have Max, but Max Kaiser went on to call Jamie Dimon the devil, and on a rant about it, and we totally disagree with that. But he really thinks, Max thinks that the whole thing is sort of that they're getting away with not literally but figuratively murder on the taxpayers, and they are, and that's the way the company's almost set up. The banks are too big; they can't control what some of these traders are doing anymore, and they're not being punished enough at all in some cases for the things that are going on. And by the way, I'm picking on J.P. Morgan today. This is endemic of the large banks, and it's endemic of our banking industry. And we're living in a situation where they have too much power. And when one group gets too much power and too much lobbying power on K Street, they will literally they will literally be the kind of people that will do the wrong thing. They will oppress the shareholders. You got the clip? Oh, let's try that clip again. But it's clip 4, and this is Max Kaiser. We'll have a little laugh on this one, but go ahead with Max Kaiser out there on Jamie Dimon.
The transubstantiation that backs the Eucharist of the Catholic Church, this is more like outright devildom. This is the devil. Because Jamie Dimon is saying, basically, that he wants to make money by creating more devilish securities with no collateral, instead of lobbying for simply raising interest rates. Because if you raise interest rates, then you can make money the old-fashioned way, which is to loan money. But Jamie Dimon doesn't want to be a banker. He doesn't want to be in the business of lending money to make money on those loans. He wants to be in the devil business. He is Satan, essentially, and he comes forward with his trifecta of fraud, which is the transformation and transubstantiation and transcollateralization of all garbage that is wantonly spewed throughout the universe as collateral for his bonus money. That's the devil. That's Satan. Jamie Dimon is Satan. If you see him on the street, you know what to do.
That was not a Saturday Night Light skit. That was actually a pretty serious guy who just sort of lost it in the, if If you watch the clip, you'll see that the lady announcer next to him is doubled over. But really, things have gone too far, and in the banks, and we've got to get it back to where it needs to be. And one of the ways we can do that, well, there's two of the ways we can do that. One, we can get these banks to be smaller, and we've got to get our elected officials to focus in on that so we don't have this problem. There are other things we can do too. The question really comes down to when you ask yourself, can this happen again? Now, if you ask the chairman of Morgan Stanley, he'll look you in the face and say the odds are zero of a financial collapse due to what we're doing here in the banks. And Morgan Stanley, somewhat to its credit, has gotten out of some of the trading and the derivatives and so forth, and focused more on brokerage firms and on the brokerage business and so forth. But no. Let me read you what Stanford economist Anat Adamati says. Could it happen again? You bet it can, says Anat, a professor of finance and economics at Stanford and co-author of The Banker's New Clothes, a book published in February, et cetera, et cetera. That's because big banks are still too deeply hooked on borrowing and on making deals in shadow markets that are almost impossible for regulators to track. Fundamentally, not much has changed, she says. There is still a lot of risk in the opaque markets that we don't see, still a lot of leverage that we only discover when it's too late. That really is a major point. Right now, there are things going on in banks that we won't know until it's too late, because banks have stopped, in many cases, or lessened being real banks. They don't just lend money. They're involved in opaque securities, credit derivatives, massive leverage that the regulators don't even know about. In fact, when the laws were put in for Dodd-Frank, and Dodd-Frank is simply the massive regulation formed after all these crises, no matter what it is, whether Nixon resigns or something, there's always going to be a church commission. There's going to be something that goes on. Dodd-Frank is thousands of pages, which I doubt anybody has really read. And when you look at who lobbied along the way to Dodd-Frank, it was the banks. They've been able to water down regulations aimed at keeping them from taking those bad loans and putting them off on investors by requiring. They want them to require that they hold larger portions of the loans in their own books. They've made sure that rules requiring transparent exchange-based trading of derivatives, those intricate financial contracts that magnified what could have been manageable losses into global financial catastrophe, are shot full of loopholes. That's what's been going on in America. That's why we don't know. And that's why we go back to the very beginning of the show and just say this one basic fact. And you know how things went so awry from 2008 to today, when not the Republicans, not the Democrats, not both parties, not our elected officials came up with one simple thing that we could understand. The banks have to be smaller. Everybody gets that. No. What did they do? They came up with, let's tell the people there's really a worry about the run of the banks and make them feel safer. So we'll have Hank Paulson come out and say everything's going to break down, the world will end, and everybody will go broke if we let Goldman Sachs, where he worked and where his money was, if we let Goldman Sachs and Citibank and JP Morgan and AIG go down. We'll scare the public on Main Street, even though they're at no risk. We could do a whole show on AIG and state regulations and where AIG's money was. It was in states and it wasn't coming back out whether they went bankrupt or not. It just wasn't coming back out. So Hank Paulson and the FDIC, they all got together and said, let's make sure that people feel safer, even though they're perfectly safe right now. Let's take FDIC insurance, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. When you go into a bank, you have $100,000 that's totally safe at any bank. And if you go to 5 banks and put $100,000, you'd have $500,000 that was safe. And if you're married, like I am, you could take $100,000 in a wife's account, $100,000 in the husband's account, and $100,000 in a joint account. So that's $300,000 total 100% protection that you'd never lose. And then you ask yourself this one question. Drive down any road. If you're in Mississippi right now listening, you're in Colorado, just drive down and look down a road and say, who in that house has more than $300,000 in a bank? What single guy, 28-year-old guy over there has more than $100,000 in a bank? But they decided, we'll make it $250,000. Then you have to walk down the road or drive down on your bike or on your motorcycle and look down and say, Which married couple on the left over there has $750,000 in one bank? When if we go to the next corner, the major corner, there's at least two banks on each intersection. There's gonna be a gas station, a bank, and usually a Dunkin' Donuts or something. So of course, that wasn't true. It was just made up. It was made up so that Main Street, the regular folks out there, said, oh, I guess they're doing something for us. And in the meantime, with a sleight of hand, let's give $800 billion to the banks so that their executives don't lose their bonuses. We'll tell everybody there's a contagion. It's like a flu. Everybody's going to get it. When it wasn't true at all. Main Street wouldn't have gotten it. There were many. What about the other 6,934 banks? It doesn't matter, by the way, it's Citibank. All that money would have been protected in the deposits. Just the stocks would have went to zero. And they should have. And then people would have learned their lesson. It wouldn't have happened again. Much like after Enron went broke and Arthur Andersen was broken to zero because of that, I'm sure there were a lot of people working there who lost their entire net worth. And at least their friends, accountants, and other people said, hey, we ain't doing that again. We may be doing some other stuff, but we're not doing that. And that's how people will learn their lesson. But now we're in a situation where it's actually so dangerous. And we're going to do shows about debt. We're going to do shows about China. We're going to do shows about treasuries. We're going to do a lot of shows about different subjects. But what we have now is a situation where the American public has been put at risk by our elected officials in the banking system because 6 banks now have the power. You know how much power you really have if you walk in and say, I'm really too big to fail and you can't take me down? I've got 15% of the assets of every American. And if you take me down and find out what's going on, they do this con game with each other that I'm too big to fail. So just find me $13 billion, says Jamie Dimon, because look at his situation goes something like this. He takes out a pen back in 2008. He's been studying. He's a smart guy. He's been looking at Washington Mutual to get a bigger footprint into the mortgage business. He's been looking at Bear Stearns like everybody's been looking at him. So he probably looked at it when it was $20 a share, when it was $10 a share, when it was $80 a share. He said, I can't pay that. I can't pay that. That wouldn't be good for my equity. And he looks down and finally he says, $3.5 billion? I get both companies? He just writes down on a piece of paper, what if I got to pay $20 billion in fines? Or what if it's $50 billion more in losses? He writes down a number. And whatever number he wrote down, he's perfectly okay paying $13 billion in fines today. He's totally okay in paying 12% of his net income since the financial collapse in different fines for different regulation violations because he makes $10 or roughly $10 and pays out $1 to the regulators. He still has a good return on equity. And guess what? JP Morgan stock is at an all-time high. That's where we are, folks. A dangerous situation put on your backs with the Federal Reserve keeping rates so low that you can't save. And you're sitting there saying, I've got to invest this money, I guess, in the stock market. And everybody's getting back in at 15,000 when they got out at, 9,000, 6,000, whatever it was at the bottom in March of 2009, when, by the way, they changed the laws. Then to mark to market, we'll have a show about that. Mark to market went away and mark to duration came in. So this is it, folks. Well, I think we've had a great time here today. We're going to have to end up the show. I want to go over the 3 points with you. The banks got too big. They've got too much power. We know it's happened. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's an American issue because now we are at great risk in our financial future. We've got to find a way to make the bank smaller. No bank can have over 1/2 of 1%. I just made that up. We can make it 0.3%. 1/2 of 1% of the American net assets in any one bank. We've got to take the banks and then the investment banks and say no more. 1933, it went great to 2001. And in 2001, you changed the law, and there we are. And then we've got to make sure people, when they get a loan, get it back. And we're going to get out of here right now. It's Steve Laffey. Steve Laffey's Fixing America. God bless you.
You've been listening to Steve Laffey's Fixing America radio program on the Laffey Radio Network. Fixing America is broadcast Monday through Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. right here at www.laffeyradio.com. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this broadcast without the express written consent of Laffey Network, LLC is prohibited.